When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked into the Senate hearing expecting another televised victory, she clearly believed the room would operate by the familiar rules of Washington performance politics. She had the cameras, the talking points, the ideological framing, and the confidence of someone who had spent years turning confrontation into political currency. But while she was still pointing directly at Vice President JD Vance, the atmosphere changed with one sentence. "Congresswoman, you just testified falsely under oath, and I am going to prove it in the next 40 minutes. Bernie Sanders, sitting behind her, went completely still. Elizabeth Warren looked down at the table, and Jasmine Crockett visibly froze as the Democratic side realized this was no longer going to be a comfortable exchange of rehearsed accusations. On the Republican side, Josh Hawley leaned forward. Tim Scott carefully set down his pen, and Tom Cotton folded his hands as though everyone in the room had suddenly understood that the hearing had shifted from political theater into something far more dangerous. 3 hours earlier, Senate Dirksen Room 538 had looked like standard Washington choreography, polished, predictable, and designed for television clips rather than accountability. The subject was the national housing crisis, and Democrats had invited Ocasio-Cortez to attack the administration's working family housing policy, while presenting herself as the uncompromising defender of ordinary Americans. She entered believing J.D. Vance could be reduced to a familiar caricature: Yale-educated, venture capital connected, culturally distant from the Bronx, and politically vulnerable to accusations that he had abandoned the working class he claimed to represent. She also believed Bernie Sanders, sitting behind her as an invited House guest, would remain part of the same political front that had carried their shared anti-oligarchy message across the country. Most importantly, she believed the C-SPAN cameras were her stage, but she had badly misjudged who had come prepared to control the room. For the first 2 hours, everything appeared to be moving in her favor. She attacked Trump, attacked Republicans, described the administration's tax plan as economic devastation for poor Americans, and accused Vance of betraying the Appalachian communities he had built his political identity around. She charged the Republican Party with carrying out systemic devastation against the working class, delivering the accusation with the confidence of someone accustomed to seeing the moral burden placed entirely on the other side. Vance did not interrupt, argue, or perform outrage for the cameras. He simply sat at the chairman's position and wrote slowly on a yellow legal pad. That silence was not weakness, and the room was about to discover that every minute he had spent listening had been used to build the sequence that would now trap her inside her own standards. At 12:47 p.m., Ocasio-Cortez finished her opening statement, yielded her remaining time, and said she looked forward to the chairman's questions. Vance looked up and told her he had 47 of them, beginning with the claim she had just made under oath that the Republican housing plan would displace 2 million working families. She confirmed the statement and insisted the data supported it, but Vance did not debate the number or give her room to retreat into a broader ideological speech. He simply told her he was going to hold her to those words and moved immediately to question 2. The structure was already becoming obvious. No sprawling cable news argument, no rhetorical escape hatch, only a chain of public statements, followed by demands for direct answers. Vance then cited her March statement that no elected official should ever take corporate money and still claim to represent working people. Ocasio-Cortez confirmed that she had written it and said she continued to stand by it, a response that sounded confident until the next question placed that standard directly against her own political history. Vance raised the roles of Brand New Congress PAC and Justice Democrats PAC, both founded by her former chief of staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, and noted that she had served on the board of Justice Democrats from December 2017 until June 2018. She acknowledged that the basic facts were correct, but the tone of the hearing had already changed, because Vance was no longer asking what she believed. He was asking whether the moral rules she imposed on everyone else would survive contact with her own record. Then came the approximately $885,000 in transfers cited in a Federal Election Commission complaint involving two limited liability companies owned by her chief of staff. The transfers had been labeled strategic consulting. The complaint had generated an official case file, and Vance asked the simplest possible question. Was she aware of those transfers while serving on the board of Justice Democrats? Ocasio-Cortez reached for the familiar defense that the complaint was politically motivated, but Vance cut straight through the framing and repeated the demand for a yes or no answer. After 4 seconds of silence, she said she had not been aware of the specific accounting. In a televised Senate hearing, 4 seconds is long enough for everyone watching to understand that the witness is searching for a door that may not exist. Vance then turned her own political standard back on her with surgical precision. If a Republican member of Congress had sat on the board of a political action committee that transferred $885,000 to private companies owned by the member's chief of staff, would she still describe that Republican as a representative of working people rather than corporate money? She tried to dismiss the premise as baseless, but Vance reminded her that the FEC case file existed and offered to read the number directly into the official hearing record. She did not answer, and across the aisle, Elizabeth Warren picked up her pen, wrote something privately, then put the pen down and folded her hands. That small gesture said more than another partisan speech could have said, because the first crack in AOC's protection was not coming from Republicans, but from the sudden silence of people who normally knew exactly when to defend her. Vance looked down at the legal pad and delivered the line that defined the method of the entire hearing. "Congresswoman, you wrote the rule, not me. I am just reading it back to you." He still had 42 questions remaining, and the next one moved directly to her claim that the greatest enemy of the American worker was the billionaire class that shipped jobs overseas. She confirmed the statement and said she stood by it, apparently unaware that Vance was about to connect that principle to one of the most celebrated decisions of her political career. In February 2019, she had publicly celebrated the collapse of Amazon's planned HQ2 project in Long Island City, a project expected to bring roughly 25,000 jobs with an average projected salary of about $150,000. The argument was no longer about slogans, because Vance was preparing to ask what happens when a politician who claims to fight for workers celebrates the disappearance of tens of thousands of jobs. And that was where the hearing was about to become far more dangerous, because the next confrontation would not leave AOC isolated only from Republicans. A single question was about to force Bernie Sanders, sitting directly behind her, to decide whether loyalty to an ally mattered more than defending the working class principles on which he had built 4 decades of political credibility. Vance moved directly into the Amazon question, asking whether Ocasio-Cortez had celebrated the cancellation of a headquarters that was expected to create roughly 25,000 jobs in Queens, jobs carrying an average projected salary of about $150,000. And she answered that she had, because, in her view, the deal was corporate welfare. He then cited former Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo, hardly a Republican surrogate, who had called the collapse of the project one of the greatest tragedies he had seen in government. And when AOC tried to redirect the issue toward her political differences with Cuomo, Vance brought her straight back to the only point that mattered. Did he say it? Yes or no? She finally admitted that he had. And at that moment, the hearing stopped, being a clean partisan confrontation, because the record Vance was using against her was increasingly filled with statements from Democrats, public agencies, bipartisan bodies, and institutions she could not simply dismiss as right-wing propaganda. Then Vance turned toward Bernie Sanders, who was seated behind her after months of campaigning alongside her under the banner of fighting the oligarchy, and asked whether preventing 25,000 well-paid jobs from coming to Queens had really helped the working class, or whether, in his heart, he believed it had hurt the people of that borough. Sanders, a man who had spent decades answering hostile questions without hesitation, declined to answer and called the issue hypothetical, and that refusal landed harder than any Republican attack because AOC turned slightly and saw that the most important ideological ally in the room would not defend her when the cost of doing so was measured in actual jobs. Vance did not celebrate Sanders' refusal. He simply thanked him and returned to the witness, which made the moment even more damaging, because there was no theatrical victory lap to distract from what had just happened. He asked how many of those 25,000 jobs she had personally replaced in her district since 2019. And when she tried to argue that congressional districts did not work that way, he supplied the answer he had already prepared. 0, followed by Bureau of Labor Statistics figures showing net private sector job creation in New York's 14th congressional district at negative 4,200 over the period he cited. His argument was brutally simple and politically devastating. By the logic she had publicly celebrated, the district had not merely lost the opportunity for 25,000 new jobs, but had also experienced thousands of additional job losses, leaving her anti-billionaire rhetoric sitting next to an economic record that did not cooperate with the slogan. He asked whether she wanted to revise her earlier statement that the billionaire class was the greatest enemy of the American worker, and she refused, saying she stood by it, even as the room increasingly understood that Vance was not trying to make her abandon her ideology, but forcing her to own the consequences attached to it. By then, producers and political staff outside the room were no longer treating the hearing as routine programming, because what had begun as another Washington confrontation was becoming a public test of whether progressive moral certainty could survive sustained contact with public records, numbers, and the refusal of allies to provide automatic cover. Then, Vance opened a new section of his notes and moved to the House Ethics Committee report concerning the 2021 Met Gala, a bipartisan document that found Ocasio-Cortez had failed to fully comply with House gift rules by accepting improper benefits connected to the event and failing to pay full fair market value for certain items. He walked through the ticket price, the dress, the hair and makeup costs, the reduction in the dress rental price after conversations involving her staff, and the 5-month delay before a small business owner providing hair and makeup services was fully paid, forcing the hearing into territory where every carefully constructed image of solidarity with ordinary workers now had to coexist with the optics of a congresswoman wearing "Tax the Rich" at one of the most exclusive social events in America. AOC acknowledged that her staff had handled the payments and said she took responsibility. But Vance narrowed the question again, asking whether a working-class hairdresser had in fact waited 5 months to be paid $477 by a member of Congress who had attended a $35,000 per-person gala in a dress carrying a message about taxing the wealthy. She lowered her eyes and answered yes, and the contrast was so politically poisonous that Vance barely needed embellishment. The facts, arranged in sequence, were doing the work on their own, turning a symbolic act of progressive defiance into an argument about class hypocrisy, delayed payment, elite access, and the gap between branding and behavior. He then compared the ethics penalty to the approximate monthly rent paid by residents in Hunts Point and asked the question that stripped away every layer of ideological protection. On that night, who exactly was the rich? Before AOC could recover, the fracture inside the Democratic coalition widened in public. John Fetterman, speaking without having been called on, said he disagreed with Vance on most political issues and expected to continue voting against much of the Republican agenda, but he refused to pretend he had not heard what had just been presented in the room. He invoked his own working-class constituents in Braddock, Pennsylvania, explaining that a 5-month delay on a $477 payment could mean collections, damaged credit, missed medical care, and real consequences for an ordinary family, then told Ocasio-Cortez that she could not wear "Tax the Rich" at a $35,000 a plate event while leaving a hairdresser waiting months to be paid. That intervention changed the political geometry of the hearing, because criticism from Republicans could be dismissed as partisan hostility, but criticism from a Democratic senator with his own blue-collar political identity could not be neutralized so easily without exposing an even deeper conflict inside the party. And AOC was about to answer with the strongest counterattack she had left, one aimed directly at Vance's childhood, his wealth, Peter Thiel, his failed nonprofit, and the grandmother whose life had made him famous. But the problem was that Vance had been waiting for exactly that attack. Ocasio-Cortez did not retreat quietly, because she had not built her career by allowing an opponent to define the battlefield without resistance. And when she finally leaned toward the microphone again, she came back with the most personal and politically dangerous attack available to her. She cited hillbilly elegy, accused Vance of blaming Appalachian decline on culture and personal responsibility, raised his connection to Peter Thiel, his work in venture capital, his personal wealth, and the failure of our Ohio renewal, then drove the argument directly into the most sensitive part of his public identity by invoking his grandmother. Her accusation was blunt. Vance had not merely left the struggling communities he wrote about. He had turned their suffering into a product, sold the story, built a national profile from it, and then returned to Washington wealthy enough to lecture other politicians about working people. For the first time in the hearing, Democrats on the dais visibly responded. Elizabeth Warren and Raphael Warnock acknowledged the force of the attack. John Fetterman nodded once, and Bernie Sanders finally broke his silence to say that it had been well said. For a brief moment, the political pressure reversed, and AOC looked as though she had finally found the one subject capable of forcing Vance out of his methodical rhythm and into the kind of emotional defense that could unravel the entire hearing. But Vance did not deny the attack, and that refusal to run from the record immediately destroyed the easiest path available to AOC. He confirmed that he had written Hillbilly Elegy, that he had argued culture mattered alongside economics, that Peter Thiel had supported his Senate campaign, that he had worked in venture capital, that his financial disclosure showed substantial personal wealth, and that the criticism of our Ohio renewal was legitimate. He acknowledged that the nonprofit had spent heavily on consultants, that it had closed, and that he considered its failure one of the real regrets of his life before politics, taking responsibility without trying to hide behind staff, procedural language, or accusations that the questions were unfair. He also confirmed that his grandmother had died owing money for insulin, the very detail AOC had intended to use as evidence that he had profited from the pain of the people he claimed to represent. By conceding the facts instead of fighting them, Vance denied her the spectacle of a politician caught pretending the public record did not exist. And that distinction mattered, because the entire hearing had already become an argument about whether powerful people would apply the same standards to themselves that they demanded from everyone else. Then, Vance returned to the Met Gala and asked who had personally invited Ocasio-Cortez to the event. When she answered that the invitation came through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he cited the ethics report and stated that Anna Wintour had personally invited her and arranged for the designer to dress her, then moved to Wintour's history as a major Democratic donor and fundraiser. The point was not merely that AOC had attended an elite event, because politicians attend elite events every day in Washington and New York. The point was the contradiction between condemning moneyed political influence in public while accepting extraordinary access through a figure deeply connected to the same political fundraising ecosystem. Vance laid the sequence out without needing to exaggerate it. A major Democratic donor, a $35,000 per ticket event, an expensive dress, a reduced rental cost after staff conversations, free admission for her partner in violation of House rules, and the slogan "Tax the Rich" displayed across her back for the cameras. Then he asked whose pain she had been monetizing that night, turning her accusation about his grandmother directly back toward the political brand she had brought into the room. AOC did not answer, and Bernie Sanders did not repeat that her attack had been well said. Vance then addressed the subject she had raised, speaking about Bonnie Vance, the grandmother known in his family as Mama, and explaining that she had been more than a character in a best-selling book or a useful symbol in a political argument. He described her as the woman who had protected her family, who had spoken with brutal directness, who had died while he was deployed to Iraq, and whose funeral he had missed, a fact he said he would carry for the rest of his life. He said the first money he used from the success of Hillbilly Elegy went toward paying her funeral debt and the outstanding insulin balance she had left behind. Then said he and his wife had established a scholarship in her name for first-generation college students from Appalachian counties. The political force of the response came from the fact that he did not ask anyone in the room to agree with his ideology. He demanded only that the woman who had raised him not be reduced to a weapon by someone who had never known her. The room changed again, and this time the shift was harder for AOC to reverse because her strongest personal attack had not produced the contradiction she needed. Vance had admitted the uncomfortable parts of his record, acknowledged his wealth, accepted responsibility for failure, and then supplied his own answer to the accusation that he had simply exploited his grandmother's suffering for profit. That did not make every criticism of him disappear, and it did not magically turn political disagreement into agreement, but it exposed a difference in defensive strategy that the cameras could not miss. When confronted with damaging facts, he had answered them directly, while much of the hearing had shown AOC trying to reframe, redirect, or escape the narrow question. The contrast became the real weapon, because Vance no longer needed to claim moral purity. He only needed to show that he was willing to stand inside his own record while demanding that she stand inside hers. And with 17 questions still remaining, he was about to move away from personal hypocrisy and into the part of the record that reached directly into her district, where rising crime, limited office access, and the distance between national activism and local representation would become impossible to dismiss as merely another ideological disagreement. What came next was even more dangerous than the Met Gala or the fight over money, because this time the witnesses were not donors, ethics investigators, or political rivals.